Well, hello, dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode in our close reading series of Naturalism and Religion by Graham Oppy. We're still in the fifth chapter, Does Science Defeat Naturalism?, which is a critical analysis of Alvin's Plantinga's argument that science supports theism over naturalism. And his claim is actually divided into three claims, that there is but merely apparent conflict between science and theism, that there is but superficial conflict between theism and science, and thirdly, there is deep concord between science and theism. Oppy went through each claim, trying to debunk it, and we reached the conclusion that there is nothing to suggest that theism is more supported by science than naturalism is. Remember that so far Oppy's aim isn't to say that naturalism is more supported by science, but that there is no evidence that science supports theism over naturalism, which is Plantinga's claim. Still, there's another important argument in Plantinga's book where the conflict really lies, and the second part of the chapter is about analyzing that argument, which argues or tries to argue that evolution supports theism over naturalism, and this argument is called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or EAAN, or we can just call it EAAN. So in the previous video, so the video of last week, we've seen why the three claims that Plantinga is making, they don't hold. And now, so this week, we are going to see this particular argument, the EAAN argument. So what is the EAAN? Actually, there are two versions of the EAAN as presented by Plantinga in their, official and final form. The first one goes as follows. So first you have three notions. You have the notion R, the notion N, and the notion E. So R means it's the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. N is the proposition that naturalism is true, and E is the proposition that we and our cognitive faculties have come to be in the way proposed by contemporary evolutionary theory. So with these three notions, we can move to the argument, which is an argument from probability. So the first premise is the probability of R, meaning the probability of the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable, is low, giving N and E. Meaning the probability that our faculties are reliable is low, giving naturalism, and giving that our cognitive faculties have come to be in the way that they are, like contemporary evolutionary theory tells us. So probability of R giving N and E is low. Second premise: anyone who accepts N and E and sees that probability of R giving N and E is low has a defeater for R. And premise 3, anyone who has a defeater for R has a defeater for any other belief she thinks she has, including N and E itself. 4, if one who accepts N and E thereby acquires a defeater for N and E, then N and E is self-defeating and cannot rationally be accepted. And so 5, conclusion, hence N and E cannot be rationally accepted. So this is, like we said, a probabilistic argument that tries to conclude that naturalism is self-defeating because naturalism makes three claims which contradict each other. We have claim R, N, and E. Naturalism takes the three of them to be true, but Plantinga's point is that if N and E are true, then R cannot be true. Or at least the degree of confidence in R is not true. The degree of confidence in R, that R is true, is not appropriate, and so naturalists cannot consistently believe in R. In other words, if naturalism is true, and that we and our cognitive faculties are the result of evolutionary theory, then we are the result of evolution, like contemporary evolutionary theory describes evolution, then we cannot believe that our cognitive faculties are reliable. It's a version of the the claim that I can't trust my mind if naturalism is true, which we already kind of tackled in the last video, but this time it's a version that wants to involve evolution. So if we boil down the argument, it would be that if we believe in naturalism and that our cognitive faculties have evolved from unguided evolution, then the belief in the reliability of our faculties will be highly implausible. In other words, the probability of belief R on naturalism is very low, but Plantinga argues that with theism, the probability won't be very low. So probability of R giving T, where T means theism, will be higher than the probability of R giving N, where N is naturalism. Then we have a second version of the EAAN argument called the EAAN prime, which goes like this. So proposition R prime, no, we have another proposition. So this proposition says that our cognitive faculties that produce our metaphysical beliefs are reliable. N, naturalism is true. E, we and our cognitive faculties have come to be in the way proposed by contemporary evolutionary theory. And so now we move to the argument. First premise, the probability of R prime giving N and E is low. Second premise, anyone who accepts N and E and sees that probability of R prime giving N and E is low has a defeater for R prime. Premise 3, anyone who has a defeater for R prime has a defeater for any other metaphysical belief she thinks she has, including N and E itself. Premise 4, if one who accepts N and E thereby acquires a defeater for N and E, then N and E is self-defeating and cannot rationally be accepted. And so, conclusion 5, hence, N and E cannot be rationally accepted. So let's focus on the second argument for a minute. Clearly, it's exactly the same as EAAN, except for a slight change in the first proposition, proposition R. R prime states that our cognitive faculties that produce our metaphysical beliefs are reliable. But this is just the same argument with a weaker premise. And so Oppy argues that this cannot be a good argument for theism. If we go with EAAN prime, then we would have a probabilistic argument that argues that the probability of R prime giving theism is not very low, right? But there's an issue here, which is that R and R prime aren't equal in terms of probability. As Oppy writes, clearly, the probability of R prime is very low. So Plantinga starts with a faulty premise, if you want. The premise R prime, which is our cognitive faculties that produce our metaphysical beliefs are reliable, is specific to the cognitive faculties in question. He's not saying that all of our cognitive faculties, including also those that produce metaphysical beliefs, are reliable. If that's the case, then he's saying exactly the same thing as R. So there won't be any difference between EAAN and EAAN prime. So no, he's specifically talking about the kind of cognitive faculties that produce metaphysical beliefs. They are the ones reliable here. And Plantinga's aim is to say that naturalism would take R prime to be plausible, since they believe that naturalism is true and that naturalism is a metaphysical belief. It wouldn't make sense if I tell you that I believe X, that I take X to be true, but that my cognitive faculties that produce X are unreliable. But Plantinga will try to say that this is the contradiction that naturalists will necessarily run into. If naturalism is true, then R prime will be implausible. That is, the probability of R prime giving N and E is low. And if R prime is implausible, then all of our metaphysical beliefs are unreliable, including naturalism. So what naturalists are telling you is not to trust the judgment of naturalists, and so it is self-defeating. The issue is that this relies on the supposition that R prime is plausible, that our faculties that produce metaphysical beliefs are indeed reliable, but this premise is already controversial on its own. Like, I don't see how Plantinga can make the claim that the same faculties that produce metaphysical beliefs are reliable. If R prime is true or highly plausible, then we would expect our cognitive faculties to produce a preponderance of true beliefs over false beliefs, at least about metaphysical beliefs. Like, we would have a few metaphysical beliefs that are false, and most of the time they would be true, right? Most of them would be true. Which means that we expect to find general agreement about metaphysical beliefs from philosophers to the general public. If our faculties are reliable and they produce metaphysical beliefs, then those beliefs should be plausible too, right? But if that's the case, we shouldn't have a majority of false beliefs or deep disagreement about almost every single one of those beliefs, right? But it's not what we find. As Oppy says, but there is simply no agreement among philosophical experts or among the broader public on a wide range of metaphysical beliefs. Indeed, in many cases in which there is division of opinion among the philosophical experts, there is no metaphysical belief that is accepted by anywhere near as much as half of those experts. And Oppy even highlights that the disagreements they go, further than just about different metaphysical beliefs, but even within agreed upon beliefs. Theists, for example, they agree on some metaphysical matters, yet even within those matters that they agree upon, well, they still disagree. There is enormous division of opinion about metaphysical matters among Protestant theists, and there is enormous division of opinion about metaphysical matters among evangelical Protestant theists, and so on. You can apply this to every religion or to every single metaphysical belief whatsoever, even non-theistic ones, by the way. Like secular metaphysicians also have the same enormous division of opinion about shared metaphysical systems or claims. Now, this would also include naturalism, since naturalism is also a metaphysical belief, right? Like a metaphysical claim. And Plantinga tries to show that if naturalism is true, then R prime is implausible, but it's plausible under theism. But what Oppy is saying is that R prime is already implausible, which Plantinga can take as an admitted defeater of naturalism from the start, that naturalists are saying, don't trust us since we are making a metaphysical claim and all metaphysical claims are implausible. But this doesn't really matter, at least for now. What matters is that Plantinga's belief that R prime would be plausible given theism. But this is where the weakness lies, because we'll see that what Plantinga says about naturalism actually also applies to his theism because of that first premise. So, like we said, from an empirical point of view, that premise is already implausible. The question then becomes, does it become more plausible given theism? But for it to become more plausible or just plausible given theism, we're going to need to do some heavy mental gymnastics that math probability cannot help you because it works actually against you. So, off the bat, Plantinga shoots himself in the foot with that first premise in EAAN prime. We can simply reject R prime with simple empirical evidence and conclude that the probability of R prime is very low from the start. And if the probability of R prime is very low, then the probability of T is also going to be very low. So yeah, Plantinga undermined his whole demonstration there. He wanted to prove that the probability of T is not very low, but with the probability of R prime, that's just not going to happen. So let's do a little bit of math probability to understand this. So if the probability of a claim is low, then the probability of a conjunction of that claim and another claim will also be low. For example, the probability of you are finding $1 million under your bed tonight is pretty damn low, right? So if you add any other claim, even if that claim on its own is highly plausible, like you will find your bed tonight when you get home. So that claim will not make the conjunction of finding your bed and the $1 million under your bed more plausible. So this is the rule. The probability of a conjunction is less than or equal to the probability of either conjunction. So the probability of A and B, meaning that probability that both A and B are true, it's not the probability of A and the probability of B, but the probability that you have both A and B. So the probability of A and B will always be either equal or less than the probability of A or the probability of B. In other words, the probability that both A and B, the probability that it occurs, is never greater than the probability that either one occurs on its own. But I think Oppy should have stressed something important here in the rule. To say that the probability of a conjunction is less than or equal to the probability of either conjunct means that it will always be less than or equal to the probability of the less plausible conjunct. It's obvious, when you think about it, because if the probability of A and B is either less than or equal to probability of A and is also equal or less than probability of B, it will not become greater than the probability of A just because probability B is greater than probability A, for example. I say this because I know sometimes your intuition can mislead you. Intuitively, you can feel that if I add a more probable, a more plausible, conjunct, the probability of the conjunction will be higher. And if it is equal or less than either conjunct, if you have a plausible and an implausible conjunct at the same time, then the probability of the conjunction can be equal to the plausible conjunct, and therefore its probability is greater than the implausible conjunct's probability. But that's a mistake, okay? In the case of Plantinga, even if theism is highly plausible, the fact that R prime is implausible, it won't make the probability of the conjunction of theism and R prime greater than the probability of R prime, which means that the probability of R prime and T, and theism, is equal or less than the probability of R prime, which means that it will still be very low. So you'll have this equation. So the probability of R giving theism equals probability of R prime. Probability of R prime giving theism equals the probability of R prime and theism divided by the probability of theism, which means that probability of R prime and theism equals the probability of R prime giving T multiplied by the probability of theism. The issue is that since probability of R prime and T is low, this will force theists to either accept that probability of T of theism is very low, or that the probability of R prime giving T is very low, which provides a defeater to T, a defeater to theism. What theists were hoping to achieve with this is that theism is plausible, so the probability of T has to be high, and that the probability of R prime giving theism becomes also high. But given that the probability of R prime and T is low, then if the probability of T is high, then theists must accept that actually the probability of R prime or giving T is also low. And if the probability of R prime giving T is high, then the probability of T must be low. So the EAAN prime is also self-defeating for theists. Okay, we can put some numbers, to see it more clearly. Let's say, for example, that the probability of PR prime and theism is 0.01. So it's very, very low. Suppose the theist says that the probability of T, PR, so the probability of T, is high, like 0.8. Then the conditional probability must be probability of R prime giving T equals probability of R prime and T divided by probability of T. So you have 0.01 divided by 0.8. And that gives you a total of 0.0125. So that's pretty low. And in the case where you have a probability of probability of R prime giving T is high, like let's say it is 0.7, then you will have the equation 0.7 equals 0.01 giving PRT, right? So to find PRT, you divide 0.01 by 0.7, which gives you about 0.014. So it is very low again. See, there is no way out of it once you admit that So the probability of r prime and t is low, which is bound to happen given that r prime is low. And this undermines Plantinga's hope for proving that theism is plausible. So as Oppy says, if theists suppose that PR, so probability of r prime giving t, is very low, then by the very same reasoning that Plantinga adopts to show that naturalism and evolutionary theory, so that N and E is self-defeating, if probability of r prime giving N and E is very low, it follows that T is also self-defeating. So in other words, Plantinga hoped to show that naturalism is self-defeating because the probability of r prime giving naturalism is low, but that also applies to theism. Now what about EAAN? Does it suffer the same weakness as EAAN prime? Well, yes. The same thing that is wrong with the reasoning behind EAAN prime is also the reasoning behind EAAN, because the reasoning of EAAN prime is the same as the reasoning in EAAN. So Plantinga cannot suppose that these arguments or the reasoning behind them, are good. So to show that EAAN suffers the same weakness as EAAN prime, we then need to say that R is implausible, right? But we say that R and R prime aren't the same premise. While R prime is clearly and empirically implausible, the same cannot be said that easily about R. It's counterintuitive to say that all of our cognitive faculties are in reality unreliable, right? And surely it's also counterintuitive to say that most of them are unreliable. Most of us tend to think that our cognitive faculties are indeed reliable and our, scientific theories can be trusted to describe the world, right? Plantinga thinks so when he writes, like everyone else, our cognitive faculties are in fact mostly reliable. And Oppy agrees with this, that most of our faculties are reliable. But that will depend on the domain about which our faculties are making statements. In some domains, it is reasonable to trust our faculties, but in others, the sensible thing is to distrust our faculties. He says we all know that there are some domains in which our cognitive faculties are not mostly reliable. Sure, across a broad range of domains, our faculties of perception, memory, a priori intuition, sympathy, introspection, testimony, moral sense, and so forth are reliable. They do yield a preponderance of true belief over false belief. So here we have a definition of what reliability means. It is a preponderance of true belief over false belief. In R prime, its weakness is that it is a domain in which we don't have a preponderance of true belief over false belief. Now we're talking about metaphysical beliefs. And Oppy argues that in the domains of perception, of memory, of a priori intuition, of sympathy, introspection, testimony, moral sense, etc., we usually have a preponderance of true beliefs. It doesn't mean that whenever someone remembers something or gives testimony or perceives something, we must systematically be defiant towards it. Sure, there are many cases in which, our perception deceives us, where we badly remembered an event where our intuition was wrong, but in most cases where those faculties are operating, we can actually trust them. We trust most of our memories, most of our perception, most of our intuition, most of our testimonies, etc. These aren't faculties that we use once in a while, but we use them constantly, all the time, 24/7. It would be extremely dysfunctional to never trust our moral sense, our sympathy, our introspection, our memory, etc. So, we can be confident enough that in these domains, our faculties produce more true beliefs than false beliefs. But there are domains in which our faculties produce more false beliefs than true beliefs. We can say in those domains our faculties are not reliably tracking truth. And so these domains will be like domains in which there is not independent conversions of opinion. So metaphysical domains are examples of such domains. Here we talk about domains in which there is a lot of reasonable disagreements, even fundamental disagreements, and because of the lack of conversions of opinion, we can say that most beliefs produced by our cognitive faculties in those domains are most certainly false. Our faculties to track truth and our faculties, that's what they are supposed to do, okay? They track truth and they arrive at truth in many domains, but there are some domains in which they don't reliably track it, which means that they tend to produce more false than true beliefs. But we have to be careful with this wording. Not reliably tracing or tracking truth doesn't mean incapable of tracking truth. The preponderance of false belief over true beliefs can mean that our faculties in some domains aren't reliable, but not that our faculties can't track truth even in those domains. That will require at least something more than just the preponderance. For example, in many domains where there is not independent conversion of opinion, there is independent conversion of expert opinion or expertise. Given that opinions tend to be more widespread than expertise or expert opinions, we can say that the number of false beliefs here outnumber the true beliefs. So our faculties may be unreliable but not incapable of tracking truth. Oppy gives the example of science. He writes, where there are people who fail to accept well-established science, we write this off as ignorance or stupidity or the like. We do not suppose that the beliefs of the ignorant and the stupid serve to show that well-established scientific belief fails to track the truth. So, it's a case where, for example, the majority of beliefs, which happen to be false beliefs, doesn't lead us to say that there are no true beliefs in that domain, or there are no true beliefs that our faculties can grasp. We can explain, the preponderance of false belief on the account of ignorance or stupidity rather than, because our faculties are incapable of tracking truth in those domains. And therefore, we can assert that, there are domains where we have independent conversions of, opinion, so we have reliable faculties for tracking truth there. And domains where we don't have an independent convergence of opinion, but in these second domains, we have those that don't have a convergence of opinion, but have a convergence of expert opinion, which means that our faculties are still capable of tracking truth, even if they are not reliable. But then it means that we also have domains in which our faculties are just failing at tracking truth. These are domains in which you have neither convergence of opinion nor of expert opinion. Or even if there is conversions of expert opinion, the expertise is false or also unreliable. Philosophy is such a domain. It has experts and it has its professors and scholars, but that expertise never seems to converge, neither about philosophy itself nor its different branches. Oppy says, philosophy is rife with disagreement. For any pair of professional philosophers, there are countless propositions upon which they disagree. Even if the chosen pair are theists or Protestant theists or evangelical Protestant theists, they will disagree about an enormous number of philosophical propositions. In these circumstances, it would be unimaginable hubris for any philosopher to suppose that his or her uniquely privileged cognitive faculties produce a preponderance of true philosophical beliefs over false philosophical beliefs. So, even when theists try to put their different views together, they end up contradicting each other. So, even among theists, there seems to be little convergence of opinion and expert opinion. But what does it mean to have close to no conversions of expert opinion? Does it mean that most of our philosophical beliefs are false? And then, more importantly, if we aspire to be rational, must we give up on them? In other words, one cannot rationally continue to hold philosophical beliefs while also failing to believe that most of one's philosophical beliefs are true. So to remain rational, the consequence is we should give up on our philosophical beliefs, right? Well, that's what Richard Feldman believes, at least according to Oppy. Now, it's important to stress that Feldman, in his 2007 paper, reasonable religious disagreement. He doesn't argue that if we fail to believe that most of our philosophical beliefs are true, then we cannot continue to hold, our beliefs and call ourselves rational. Instead, he argues that there are cases in which there cannot be reasonable disagreement between parties. He gives the example of a class that he taught on relativism, on rationality, and also on philosophy, where there was debate among his students who didn't agree with each other. So some were theists. The majority was theist, and some were atheists. But even the theists had disagreement between themselves. But at the end of the class, the disagreements, they persisted, and they agreed to disagree and concluded, according to Feldman, that reasonable people can disagree. And this is what Feldman rejects, that reasonable people can disagree, or that there can be genuine disagreement between reasonable people. In the case of belief in the existence of God, Feldman, to say that there is, genuine disagreement, for him, it means that each party can continue to agree with themselves while disagreeing with the other, and in a justified manner, meaning that each party has good reasons to agree with only their own beliefs. Theists can continue to hold that there is God, and atheists can continue to hold that there is no God. Both have justifications for each of their beliefs, and therefore the disagreement is genuine. We have disagreement between reasonable people. But according to Feldman, this isn't possible. He goes through many cases to illustrate why in each one, if the parties are reasonable, they cannot disagree. But that doesn't mean that they must agree. If you believe that God exists and then you encounter an atheist, someone who says that there are no gods, then we have here two antithetical beliefs which cannot be both true. Either someone is missing something or mistaken about something, but they cannot be both true. To see that there is genuine disagreement is to say that both parties have good evidence for believing that their belief is true. So when you debate them and they expose you to their evidence, giving that we are both reasonable, that evidence should also affect me. Seeing why the other person believes that there is a God or that there aren't any, if indeed it's a good reason, then I should adjust my belief to that evidence and not just dismiss it or ignore it or acknowledge it in some sort of weird, tolerant and respectful way. I cannot just say, it's just your opinion, man, I respect it, but I'm not going to consider it for my belief and move on with my day, as if that evidence didn't happen. Now, when Feldman talks about justification or good reasons, he's not talking about personal experience or how useful the belief is in your life. He's talking about the base level of epistemology. You can say that if the belief is allowing the person to be psychologically functional, then it's a good reason to hold that belief, even when faced with the evidence that it may not be the case. But even then, you have to argue that being psychologically functional is first better than having true belief, and that two, a reasonable person can become psychologically dysfunctional because of holding a true belief. But this doesn't really matter because, like I said, Feldman is only interested in the base level of epistemology. You can logically still hold to your belief when there is a full and genuine evidence that the belief may not be true. And in short, can you still disagree? Can you logically, still hold to your belief when there is a full and genuine evidence that the belief may not be true? Now, if we are in a situation where it's not about may or may not be true, but it's clearly and undoubtedly not true, disagreement isn't possible. Your only option is agreement if you are reasonable or rational. But there are cases where two parties in disagreement have presented their full complete evidence as clear as possible that they can, but the disagreement continues. And here too, Feldman argues that it is impossible. The disagreement cannot continue. But it doesn't mean that agreement is your only option. Here, when both parties have acknowledged that each party's evidence is genuine and good, but both cannot be true, then the appropriate attitude is actually suspending your judgment. He calls this the modest skeptical alternative and distinguishes it from the one where only agreement is possible, which is called the hard line. Here's how he puts it. After examining evidence, you may think that this evidence supports belief P, and you cannot help but believe P. But when you see that another person, as sensible and serious as you, who has, an opposing reaction, he believes not P, then one of you must be making some kind of mistake or failing to see some truth. But if neither of you have a reason to think that the one making the mistake is the other, then in that case, the right thing to do is to suspend judgment on P. You cannot affirm that God exists or that he doesn't exist. In short, you become an agnostic, even though Feldman doesn't say that. So reasonable people can disagree. They cannot disagree. They either agree or suspend their judgment, which means that in both cases, there is at least one person who cannot continue to hold their philosophical belief. If we are forced to agree, one of us has to abandon their beliefs. If we can suspend our judgment, both must abandon those beliefs. Okay, I mean, if your belief was a belief that you consider true, if you have to suspend your belief, you cannot hold that belief anymore. You must, have a version of that belief that is agnostic. You cannot just, hold the belief as true. And holding a belief as true is also a belief. You believe that the belief P is true. So if you have to suspend your judgment, that belief, you can no longer hold it. You have to adopt another belief which says that we don't know if belief P is true. So Feldman isn't making the claim that you cannot hold your beliefs while failing to believe that most of your beliefs are true, but he does say that in the case of atheism versus theism, while it is true that only one can be true, holding on to them when we are both reasonable isn't an option. We cannot disagree. But Oppy is going to say that we can still disagree and hold on to them, but on the basis that most of our philosophical beliefs are probably not true. So can we really say that to continue to hold one's philosophical beliefs while failing to believe that most of our philosophical beliefs are true, or simply and so believing that most of our philosophical beliefs are false, is irrational? Well, no. The simple fact that there is neither convergence of opinion nor of expert opinion, which means that there is clear evidence that most of our beliefs are unlikely to be true, it doesn't mean that holding on to them is irrational. So let's go through Oppy's demonstration through a toy case. So that's a deliberately simplified artificial case for illustrating how an idea, argument, or mechanism works without the complications of real-world details. So this is a classic toy case about probabilistic coherence. It's often used to show how a reasonable local belief can coexist with reasonable global doubt. So let's begin with the setup. So Oppy says, suppose three things. A, 10 independent axioms from which you will get your philosophical beliefs. B, each axiom has credence of 51% or 0.51. And C, most of your axioms are true, meaning that at least 7 axioms out of the 10 are true. Now the first question, how much credence will this assign to C, meaning the belief that 2/3 of your axioms are true? So let's unpack this. First, let's understand the assignment by understanding the three suppositions. So the first supposition is that your philosophical system rests on 10 axioms, and their truth values are assumed to be independent. That means whether axiom 1 is true tells you nothing about whether axiom 2 is true, etc. The second supposition is that you give 51% credence to each individual axiom being true. So each axiom is more likely true than false, but only barely. Okay? You rather weakly believe each of the axioms. And lastly, the third supposition is, well, you stipulate that 2/3 of the axioms are true, so that at least 7 out of the 10 axioms are true. So this one is pretty straightforward. But given that the axioms are independent and each has a probability of 0.51 of being true, you can deduce the center of mass of the distribution, meaning how many axioms are more likely to be true. You just multiply 10 by 0.51, which gives you a result of 5.1. So the center mass of the distribution is around 5. And this means that your probability that 4, 5, or 6 axioms are true is much more likely than the probability that 7, 8, or 9, or all of your axioms are true. So the chances that 7 or more axioms are true are actually quite low, around 14%, as Oppy says. So belief in each axiom has a weak average credence, but it is higher than the belief that at least 7 of the axioms are true. Like individually, each axiom has a higher chance of being true than when at least 7 of them are true. Like I have more chances to believe that each of my axioms are true than that at least 7 of them are true. In short, if we suppose that most of our axioms are true, only if at least 2/3 are true, then I can reasonably believe that most of my axioms are not true while continuing to reasonably believe each axiom. So he says, even though I rather weakly believe each of the axioms, I rather more strongly disbelieve the claim that at least 2/3 of my axioms are true. If we suppose that most of my axioms are true, only if at least 2/3 of them are true, then in this toy case, it turns out that I quite reasonably believe that it is not the case that most of my philosophical axioms are true, while nonetheless continuing to reasonably believe each of those philosophical axioms. So there, we have a case where we can still hold on to a local belief in a global doubt. Just because most of my beliefs are unlikely to be true, it doesn't mean that my individual beliefs are as unlikely to be true. So this, however, doesn't mean that I'm dogmatic. Oppy was careful enough to assign a weak credence to this belief, to his belief, sorry, but it's a credence that is a little bit above 50%. So here I'm holding on to my beliefs, to my philosophical beliefs, but only tentatively. Okay, there's still almost one chance out of 2 that it's false. But it's just way more than claiming that most of them are true. So to hold on to my beliefs tentatively requires us to also believe that it is not the case that most of my philosophical beliefs are true, which is more realistic than asserting that most of my beliefs are true. So that would make you, dogmatic. A dogmatic person is someone who sets the standards for what counts as most too high because they assign a high credence to all of their beliefs. If you assign a 90% credence to each of your axioms, then you would argue that at least 9 of your axioms are true, and that's setting the standard way too high, and it is extremely unlikely. By contrast, someone who holds beliefs tentatively does not set the standards for what counts as most too high, and therefore they're not required to believe that most of their beliefs are true. They know that it is unlikely, and they don't pretend otherwise. But someone who holds beliefs dogmatically is someone who, on almost any standards for most, may be required to believe that most of their philosophical beliefs are true. So it's not that the probability of most of their beliefs being true is low, it's that on top of that, they have to assert that the probability is high. So yeah, these people should follow Feldman's advice and give up on their views. They need to recognize that most of their beliefs are probably not true, and because of that, they must abandon them. But that works only for dogmatists, not for tentative believers, let's say. Or as Oppy puts it, that's a problem for dogmatists and not for philosophers who are appropriately tentative in the holding of their philosophical beliefs. And with this, we can establish that R is like R prime. The kind of beliefs that Plantinga has in mind in his argument are clearly the kind of beliefs in domains in which there is no convergence of opinion, whether regular or expert opinion. He cannot use R to mean all of our cognitive faculties, since he is specifically targeting naturalism, which is a metaphysical belief. So it's a belief that's born out of the kind of cognitive faculties that produce beliefs that tend to be mostly false. So R has to be wrong. It is unreliable from the start, just like R prime. So you just apply the same process to EAAN, the same process that we saw in EAAN prime. You apply it to EAAN, while keeping in mind that this doesn't mean that theists must abandon their beliefs or that naturalism has defeated theism. What this shows is that whatever Plantinga wanted to apply on naturalism to defeat it, it also applies to theism as well, and therefore it neither defeats the other. Both naturalists and theists, as long as they don't hold on dogmatically to their beliefs, they can still hold on to their beliefs even if most of their metaphysical beliefs are probably false. So Oppy is very well aware of this, but to say that what Plantinga wrote against naturalism also applies to theism doesn't mean that his argument against naturalism fails. Maybe Plantinga self-defeated his own theism, but if he took down naturalism with it, then his argument against naturalism kind of succeeded. The fact that he may have also refuted his own big picture doesn't change the fact that he may have indeed provided a defeater for naturalist big pictures. Saying that as long as we hold on to beliefs tentatively, we should be fine doesn't seem satisfying either. We may need a more convincing counter-argument, and Oppy agrees with this. He writes, although the discussion to this point may be taken to suffice to show that Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism fails, it is clear that we have not pinpointed exactly why and where the argument fails. I'm not sure that I know exactly why and where the argument fails. However, I can see that there are many points at which questions can be raised about the argument. I now turn to an examination of some of those points. Alright, so let's see in more details what to make of Plantinga's argument against naturalism. So his point is that probability of R giving N and E is low. That's what he has to establish to provide a defeater for naturalism, even if his own reasoning provides a defeater for theism as well. So everything is about establishing that particular premise. So let's see how he does it. Well, there are two steps for this. He first argues that on naturalism and evolution, on N and E, the likelihood that any given axiom is true is 0.5. So that's the first step. If we accept N and E, then the likelihood of my axiom or belief being true never exceeds 50%. In other words, you always have at best one out of two chances that any of your beliefs are true if you accept naturalism and unguided evolution. For any given belief, N and E gives us no reason to assign any belief a probability of truth greater than about 0.5%. 0.5, so 50%. The second step, which derives from this one, is that if there is just a 50-50 chance that any given axiom delivered up by our cognitive faculties is true, then it is clear that our cognitive faculties are not reliable. So, for any given belief, N and E gives no reason to assign any belief a higher probability than 0.5 for being true than being false. Then our cognitive faculties are not reliable. So, probability of R giving N and E is low. So, given that the second step derives from the first step, the problem must lie in that first one. So to reject Plantinga's argument, it starts with rejecting that first step of the premise. Is it true that under N and E, our beliefs have at best a 50% chance that they are true? Well, let's go through a few cases. Plantinga discusses all of these except the first one, which is an Oppy exclusive, the thermostat case. We will first lay down the cases, and then in the next section, we see what we can get out of them in relation to Plantinga's first step in the premise. So, these cases are about entities that react and interact with their environment, but in different degrees, or at different degrees. starting from non-organic entities to organic entities, from thermostats to zebras. So, a thermostat is a device that regulates temperature in a wider system. It has two states, on and off. So on means have most recently turned the heating device on, and off have most recently turned the heating device off. So it regulates the temperature of the wider system because it has sensors that measure the temperature. If the sensors report that the temperature is below the low cutoff temperature, so when it is cold and the thermostat is off, it triggers the starting up of the heating device, and so the thermostat changes to on. And if they report that the temperature has risen above the high cutoff temperature while the thermostat is on, it triggers the shutting down of the heating device, and so the thermostat changes to off. In other words, the thermostat knows when the temperature is below a certain line, which it reads as cold, and so it turns itself on, and if the temperature goes beyond that line, which it reads as hot, it turns itself off. We also know that the thermostat is a purely physical device, and its states on and off are purely physical states, electromechanical states, for example. And those physical properties aren't intrinsic to the thermostat in that to make on the state in which the heating device is activated. We can change it. We can make off the state in which the heating device is actually on, in which it is activated, and we can make on the state in which it is off. It's in that sense that states aren't intrinsic properties of the thermostat. You can still call it a thermostat if you reverse the states and their role. So the state on plays a role in the regulation of the temperature of the wider system, and it is that role that makes on the state in which the heating device is turned on. So in short, we have a causal account of how the thermostat is working. The combination of the thermostats being in the off state and the sensors reporting that the temperature has fallen below the low cutoff temperature causes the starting up of the heating device and the thermostat transition to the on state. And the combination of the thermostats being in the on state and the sensors reporting that the temperature has risen above the high cutoff state causes the shutting down of the heating device and the thermostat's transition to the off state. Alright, so this is the simple straight-up account of causality of how the thermostat operates. Now, as Oppy says, if this is all you know about the thermostat and the wider system, you don't know anything else beside this particular account, then physicists and engineers know more than you about the operations of the thermostat and the wider system. And likewise, if there is more to know about the operations of the thermostat and the wider system, more than what physicists and engineers know, then we can say there is much more that an omniscient being could know about the operations of the thermostat and the wider system. So if there is still more to know, then we can say that an omniscient being knows everything there is to know or can be known about operations of the thermostat and the wider system. Of course, here we are talking about the causal information about the thermostat. So in other words, you don't have a lot of causal information about the operations of the thermostat and the wider system, and you probably have nothing compared to the physicist and the engineer and that omniscient being. However, does this imbalance between the knowledge that you have and the knowledge that you don't have and is out there, does this imbalance defeat the causal knowledge that you have, even if it is too small? Well, no. Oppy says your ignorance about how the causal information that you lack relates to the causal information that you have does nothing to defeat your causal knowledge about the operation of the thermostat. Indeed, you don't need more than the causal account provided here to know how a thermostat works. Knowing that thermostats being in the state off, plus the sensors reporting that the temperature has fallen below the low cut the low cutoff temperature equals or causes starting up of the heating device and the thermostat's transition to the on state, that doesn't require you being an engineer or an omniscient being, right? Your knowledge is still true and legit. But while your ignorance doesn't reduce your knowledge, it cannot justify some sort of other knowledge that denies, the causal account given by Oppy. For example, just because you don't know more than how the thermostat operates in that limited account, it does not give you any reason to deny that the thermostat is a purely physical device and that the causal states of the thermostat are purely physical states. Let's say, for example, that you can't, because of that lack of knowledge, infer some sort of non-natural or non-physical properties to the thermostat. You cannot suppose that the thermostat has a soul or that the on and off states are states of the thermostat's soul. In short, this ignorance of yours, or the ignorance of physicists and engineers, they are not an invitation to insert any kind of non-natural belief that you want. So that's the first case. Okay, just because you have limited knowledge about the thermostat, it's not an invitation to throw in any kind of non-natural belief that you want about the thermostat. So that's the first case. Now we move to the second case, and this one is the case of anaerobic marine bacterium. So this refers to a kind of marine bacterium, meaning a bacterium that lives in salt water, that does not require oxygen to survive. Many are in fact harmed by oxygen. That is why they are called anaerobic. The term literally means without oxygen. So many such bacteria flourish in oxygen-poor marine environments, such as sediments or stratified waters, where oxygen levels drop sharply with depth. What is interesting about some of these bacteria is that they tend to accumulate in very specific low oxygen zones, mostly in the oceans of the northern hemisphere. But unlike passive particles that merely drift with currents, many bacteria are actually capable of active movement using microscopic propellers called flagella. I think that's how it is pronounced. It's spelled Flagella. However, movement alone does not explain how these bacteria so reliably find the narrow boundary between oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor layers. In certain species, the explanation lies in the bacteria themselves. These organisms, they contain internal magnets called magnetosomes, which allow them to align their movement with Earth's magnetic field. And so these internal magnets, they do not propel the bacteria, nor do they detect, oxygen directly. Rather, they function as biological compasses. They just point to the direction that the bacteria faces. They point, to the magnetic field, and the bacterium has propulsion devices that moves it in that direction and keep doing so even if other forces conspire to drive them away from the oxygen-free depths. So by swimming along magnetic field lines, the bacteria can efficiently reach and remain in low oxygen environments because the Earth's magnetic field lines in the northern hemisphere, they slope downward into the Earth. So by following them, the bacterium is going to reach oxygen-free depths. So in short, given the way that these bacteria are oriented by their internal magnets, these bacteria are continuously propelled towards the oxygen-free depths in which they flourish. And thus, we can say that they have an orientational state. They are oriented to point towards magnetic north. But given that an orientation to point towards magnetic north is also an orientation to point towards the oxygen-free depths in which they flourish, then we can say that these bacteria are oriented to point towards the oxygen-free depths in which they flourish. Now, what to make of this? Well, don't confuse an orientational state with a representational state. A state that has content for the bacteria, a state that is about something and that plays, a causal role in guiding behavior because of that content. Although the orientation of the bacteria reliably correlates with the direction of magnetic north and can therefore serve as an indicator of north for external observers, this does not make it representational for the bacteria themselves. In this respect, the bacteria's orientation is analogous to the orientation of a compass needle. It carries information in a purely causal sense, but does not represent anything from the point of view of the compass, because the compass doesn't have a point of view anyways. So that they have, some sort of internal compass that always orients them towards a certain direction, and that external observers can see that the bacteria are oriented in the direction of the magnetic north. It doesn't mean that the bacteria have a non-natural property like souls or mental properties or something. As Oppy says, for external observers, the orientation of the bacteria is just like the orientation of a compass. And no one supposes that the orientation of a compass is a state of its soul. So representational states are typically associated with mental life, beliefs, perceptions, or intentions that are integrated into a broader network of representations and computations. But that requires having organs or systems and structures that allow for mental activity. But as Oppy says, these bacteria have neither brains nor nervous systems, and that there is no complex computation over representations that is causally responsible for the behavior that they exhibit. It's not just that these bacteria do not have beliefs or belief-like representational states, these bacteria do not have any mental life at all. So, their behavior is fully explained by physical and chemical mechanisms, without invoking beliefs, intentions, or even minimal representational states. Consequently, while their orientation can be informative to us, it is not a representational state for them, but merely a non-mental, mechanistic state that causally contributes to their movement. In the end, having an orientational state doesn't mean having a representational state. Next, we have the third case, and it's about, surely I'm gonna butcher this, Caenorhabditis elegans or C. elegans. So what is that? Well, it's a small transparent roundworm, the first multicellular organism to have its genome fully sequenced, and one of the simplest organisms with a nervous system of around 300 neurons. So this system explains some of its behavior, such as locomotion along chemical gradients towards nutrition and away from toxins, locomotion along temperature gradients, and conversion of mechanical signals into electrochemical signals. So basically it has cognitive states. So these worms, they behave differently from the marine bacteria. The bacteria, they push themselves towards magnetic north, come what may, meaning that they persistently move in the direction of magnetic north regardless of changing or conflicting conditions. So the bacteria are mechanistically biased to swim in the direction picked out by their magnets and their magnetic field, and they continue to do so without evaluating whether that direction is currently beneficial or not. They do not check whether oxygen levels are rising or falling, nor do they, revise their movement in light of, success or failure. The C. elegans, however, they follow different gradients in its environment, meaning that it exhibits behavior that suggests that they have representational states. They have content in their cognitive states such as hotter that way, more toxic this way, more food over there, get food, find mate, away from toxin, and so forth. So in other words, the content of those states explains their behavior. Why did the worm change its path? Well, because it became aware of a change in temperature or some toxins, or sent some, more food elsewhere, etc. So its path is directed by neural computing. And then we have the last and the fourth case, which is the one before last. So we have now frogs. So frogs have clearly representational states. When the frog is sitting on a lily pad, it sees a fly buzzing by. So it flicks out its tongue and it captures it, which suggests clearly that the frog must be able of tracking the trajectory of the fly. and it must be able to control its tongue to get it to where the fly is so that it captures the fly. So, like the worm, the frog probably has states with contents like hungry, food within reach, not too hot, shadow moved, find mate, and so on and so forth. And the content of those of some of these states explains the behavior of the frog. So the example with the fly may suggest that the frog's behavior of flicking out its tongue and capturing the fly was motivated by content like hungry and food within reach. Or it can be, fly within reach or small dark moving object within reach rather than food within reach or hungry for fly or hungry for meat or just hungry. Whatever the real content of these states that motivated the frog's behavior, we know that it's not going to be arbitrary, that there is only a reasonable narrow range of contents that it would be appropriate to attribute to the frog in connection to its behavior in the example. So even if there are disputes about the real content of the frog's brain, that there is still much we don't know about the full set of frog behaviors, about their environment, and perhaps even their evolutionary history, while it is plausible that whenever we attribute to it a certain content, in reality the frog had another content in mind, there are contents that we can be sure aren't it. As Oppy says, it would still be just plainly silly to suppose that arithmetic is undecidable is a relevant content, for example, in the frog's mind. That we can be sure isn't what the frog had in mind when it flicked out its tongue to catch the fly. And lastly, the fifth case are zebras. So this case is just like the frogs. You imagine a zebra grazing on the vert when it notices a lion approaching. So it starts estimating the lion, its age, sex, state, to see if it is necessary to take flight, how to take flight, when, in which direction, etc. So it can anxiously start scanning the horizon to see if it is safe to flee in that direction. Oppy writes particularly downwind, meaning that they scan the horizon in the direction of the wind, but I'm not an expert on animal behavior, so I don't know if that's true. But anyway, so they make estimations. Okay, the zebras, they make estimations. If the predator is a lioness, the zebra scans the horizon in circles to see if there are other members, females of the pride, stalking it, since lionesses, they hunt in packs. And so it retrieves to the center of the herd. If it is an old and male lion, the zebra may continue grazing because it is confident that it can easily outrun the lion. And so here too, we seem to have a range of contentful states, like hungry, danger over there, tasty grass here, sore foot, lion getting closer, and so forth. And we can argue about the precise content of the states here too, but just like the frogs, whatever the zebra's actual content may be, it's not going to be random. We cannot infer any content that we like just because we don't know for sure what is in the head of a zebra when it knows it is in the presence of a lion. So here too, it would be just plain silly to suppose that naturalism is vastly overrated, is irrelevant content in the zebra. Alright, so now that we laid down the cases, let's move to their analysis. So let's remember again Plantinga's argument for the claim that on N and E, the likelihood that any given axiom is true is 0.5. It has two steps or two parts, right? A cause and a consequence. We said that the reason why he believes that giving N and E, the likelihood of any given axiom is true is 0.5 is because he believes that giving N and E, there is no reason to suppose that any particular belief content is true. We said that the problem lies in this first step, the cause. On N and E, there is no reason to suppose that any particular belief content is true. And this claim is controversial, and so if we can show why it is mistaken, then we can refute the whole premise that probability of R giving N and E is low. So what's his reason for believing in that first step? Well, here are some clues. According to naturalists, beliefs are neural structures with no different kinds of properties: electrochemical, neurophysiological or physical properties, and content mental properties. So as we go up the evolutionary scale, we find neurostructures with greater and greater complexity. Near one end, there are bacteria, which have no beliefs. At the other end, there are human beings with rich and varied beliefs. Somewhere between, at a certain level of complexity, neurostructures start to display belief content. Perhaps it starts with C. elegans. Suppose C. elegans has beliefs. Given that C. elegans has survived for millions of years, its behavior is adaptive. That behavior is caused by the neurological structures in the C. elegans nervous system. The underlying neurology causes adaptive behavior and also determines belief content. But there is no reason on N and E why that belief content should be true. All that is required for survival and fitness is that the neurology causes adaptive behavior, and this neurology also determines belief content, but whether or not that content is true makes no difference to fitness. So, what to make of this? So, Plantinga attributes to naturalists the following belief. Beliefs are neural structures with physical and mental properties. That's how Plantinga thinks naturalists think about belief. For us, naturalists, since I'm a naturalist, when we have beliefs about anything, we just have neurological states. A belief is just that, a neural structure. Your neurons fire in some way, and that way is the belief. Now, if a belief is a neural structure, then beings that don't have neurons or anything equivalent or cannot form the proper structure for belief cannot form beliefs. And so this gives us an evolutionary complexity spectrum. Beings that can form beliefs, they tend to be more complex than those who can't. So your spectrum has two ends. The simplest forms of life, which cannot form beliefs, whether with or without neurons or equivalent, for example bacteria, all the way up to human beings, perhaps the beings with the most complex neural structures, hence including the neural structures of beliefs. So in that spectrum, perhaps the simplest beings that can form the neural structures known as beliefs are C. elegans. But if beliefs are just neural structures and neurological structures cause adaptive behavior, then 1. The content of C. elegans beliefs is determined by those structures, and 2. Beliefs have just an adaptive function. So here, whether belief is true doesn't really matter. We actually don't have any reason to suppose that the C. elegans beliefs should be true, since it is determined by neural structures, whatever the structure says, and as long as it works, as long as it helps you adapt, who cares about its truth value? If we accept naturalism and unguided evolution, then any behavior and any belief is just, valued according to its success for survival and fitness. For its truth value adds any, if its truth value adds any contribution to survival and fitness, then great. But that's not a a priority nor a necessity. We can do just fine on evolution's terms without truth. But we can object that this clearly doesn't hold in the case of frogs and zebras. It may be true that for C. elegans, truth of their belief doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them that much, adaptatively speaking. And so whether their natural structures or cognitive faculties are reliable doesn't really matter. But when it comes to frogs and zebras, we can suppose that the frog must have reliable cognitive mechanisms if it is to catch the fly, and that the zebra must have reliable cognitive mechanisms if it is to evade the lion. When the frog sees the fly, it must have some confidence that it really sees the fly and that it is going to flick out its tongue, and that it needs to be confident that it will flick it in the right direction. So it needs that its belief, fly within reach, is true. And same with the zebra. It needs a certain confidence in its belief that the lion is truly there. When it scans the horizon and doesn't see other lions, its cognitive faculties must be reliable enough for it to be sure or to trust that there is no lion, indeed in the direction it is planning to flee in. But Plantinga anticipates this objection. He argues that, of course, both frogs and zebras have indicators. Indicators are neural structures that receive some input from the creature's senses, which are correlated with the external environment and are connected to the creature's muscles in such a way as to cause the appropriate movement. In the case of the frog, its indicators receive input from the frog's sense organs. They are correlated with the path of the insect as it flies past, and are connected with the frog's muscles in such a way that it flickles out its tongue. And in the case of the zebra, its indicators, they monitor the environment, they are correlated with the presence of predators, and are connected with its muscles in such a way as to cause it to flee when a predator threatens. However, for Plantinga, that there is a correlation between the neural structure and the external reality that it reports and the creature's behavior, it doesn't mean that the creature's cognitive faculties are reliable for tracking truth. In other words, even the notion of belief is obsolete at this point. This is like, describing a machine which doesn't require the formation of belief to perform a behavior. It just sets set in motion by external forces, and thus nothing more is necessary to explain its behavior. In other words, the moment truth exits the picture, belief itself is not necessary either. Instead, we have indications which aren't beliefs, according to Plantinga. So he writes, indication does not require belief. In particular, it does not require belief having to do with the state of affairs indicated. Indeed, it is entirely compatible with belief inconsistent with that state of affairs. Indication is one thing. Belief content is something else altogether. And we know of no reason, given materialism, why the one should follow the other. Content simply arises upon the appearance of neural structures of sufficient complexity. There is no reason why that content need be related to what the structures indicate, if anything. The proposition constituting the content need not be so much as about that which is indicated. It certainly need not be true. So, for naturalists, like Plantinga understands naturalism, there are no beliefs but indications, or at least your beliefs aren't related to the indication. It's like instead of a frog, there is a camera programmed through some sort of sensors to automatically take a picture instead of flicking out a tongue whenever a fly buzzes in its field of vision. Here the camera has an indication that a fly is buzzing in front of it, and that indication is correlated with the fly actually buzzing in front of it and connected to the sensors that trigger the shooting. But it doesn't mean that the camera has a belief that a fly is buzzing in front of it, or that belief explains why the camera took a picture of the fly. As a matter of fact, for Plantinga, there's neither relation nor need for a relation between the belief and the indication. The camera would still do what it's supposed to do with or without the belief, whether the belief is true or false, or whether it is related to the indication or not. In short, indication does not require content. If C. elegans, frogs, and zebras may and probably do have beliefs, they can do without them, just like the marine bacteria. Remember, the bacterium only has its compass that point it in the direction that it needs to survive. It has, just an indication, but it has no beliefs. And sure, we can accept that bacteria have no belief. Oppy doesn't, question that. He agrees with Plantinga that bacteria have no contentful states. But that doesn't mean that what Plantinga says about indications is true. The example that I gave with the camera is basically the same as the case of the thermostat. Obviously, a thermostat has no contentful states either, so no beliefs. And obviously, neither the thermostat nor the camera has indications, since indications are neural structures in Plantinga's words. But his point is that the neural structure, called indication, works in the same way as the thermostat's sensors. Plantinga implicitly says that if naturalism is true, then naturalists have, to view the state frogs when they have indications as parallel to the thermostat's electromechanical state. So Plantinga says that on the account of naturalism, we have to see all beings, including cameras and thermostats, as just having indications but no beliefs. Plantinga isn't saying that on the account of theism you have beliefs but no indication. Rather, on theism you have both indication and belief. He's not denying the physical properties and neural structures that make, indications, but he says that without theism you have to reduce belief to just that. So for naturalists, according to Plantinga, C. elegans, frogs and zebras should only have indications like the bacteria's case, not beliefs or contentful states. But for Oppy, this is mistaken. He agrees that in the case of bacteria, we can say that, there is no belief there. But we cannot say there are indications either. As a matter of fact, this distinction between indicators, as Plantinga defines them, and beliefs isn't from naturalism. Naturalism doesn't say that your neural structures are akin to the electromechanical states of the camera or the thermostat. Plantinga doesn't mention the case of the thermostat, as we said earlier, it's all Oppy, but he discusses the case of the bacteria and the three others, the C. elegans, the frogs, and the zebras. And for him, for Plantinga, naturalists, they must treat belief in the same way as the bacteria's indications. But as Oppy says, insofar as we are taking account only of putative contentful properties, anaerobic marine organisms are much closer to thermostat than they are to zebras or frogs or even C. elegans. So there are actually no indications in Plantinga's sense, or like Oppy puts it, in the relevant sense, there is no indication in Plantinga's sense. An indication in Plantinga's sense seems to be a necessarily mechanical, hardcore deterministic relation. That is the way they are, by chance, like no intelligent mind had the purpose of making this deterministic relation the way that it is. They are just neural structures that receive input from some sense organs, and they happen to be correlated with the input source and are connected with muscles in such a way that it triggers the appropriate response. In other words, on this account, the neural structure of the frog seeing the fly buzzing nearby has to be directly connected to its tongue muscles, in the same way that the thermostat's sensors are directly connected to its heating devices, or the bacteria's magnets are connected to orientation. And so this makes the frog like bacteria, and by extension like the thermostat. As Oppy says, I think Plantinga describes zebras and frogs in a way which makes them sound much more like anaerobic marine organisms than they really are. But naturalists, they don't make this claim at all. Naturalism doesn't argue for this connection that Plantinga describes in complex life, starting from C. elegans. So Oppy says, there is no neural structure in the frog that ties perception of flying insects directly to tongue-flicking muscles. And there is no neural structure in the zebra that ties perception of lions directly to the muscle involved in urgent flight. If the frog is sated, then the frog will not flick out its tongue at flying insects. If the frog is engaged in mating, then the frog will not flick out its tongue at flying insects. If the frog is fleeing from a swooping bird, then the frog will not flick out its tongue at flying insects. If the zebra is in the middle of the herd, then the zebra will not take flight when it sees the lion. If the zebra is downwind from the lion, then it will not take flight without evidence that the lion has detected it. If the zebra has young, then the zebra will not immediately take flight without making some effort to ensure the safety of its young. So, in short, Plantinga claims that under naturalism, we have to contend that behavior is determined by what he calls indicators. It's like the frog has no choice but to flick out its tongue towards the fly every time it sees the fly. And of course, the bacteria and the thermostat don't have that luxury. Wherever the magnet points to, or whenever the sensors pick up the temperature, the bacteria and the thermostat, they just follow. But it's not the case for complex forms of life. Plantinga's account of life then is just behaviorism, actually, which is an outdated theory of psychology. It was a school of thought in psychology that explains behavior entirely in terms of conditioning, observable stimuli and responses, without appealing to inner mental states like beliefs, desires, or intentions. So behavior is acquired and modified through interactions with the environment called conditioning. There's a classic, classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dog. The dog learns by association. Like whenever you give it food, you ring a bell, and at one point, whenever you ring a bell, the dog salivates, and it starts, drooling. And there is operant conditioning, in which learning is done through reinforcement and punishment. For example, you have the famous Skinner's pigeon box, where an animal like a pigeon learns to perform actions like pressing a lever in response to reinforcement, reward, or punishment. And it seems that Plantinga's account of zebras and frogs are, behaviorist accounts. Either he actually is a behaviorist and thinks that only theism would make free will and mental life possible, like a deus ex machina, or he thinks that naturalists are behaviorists. Whatever the case, Plantinga's account of complex life is vulnerable to the same objection that behaviorism faced and didn't recover from them. And those objections didn't need to come from non-naturalists. So both Plantinga's account and behaviorism, they fail to do justice to the complex internal processing that is involved in the production of behavior. But if Plantinga claims that he's not, a behaviorist and or a behavior determinist, and so claims that when he talked about indicators, he didn't mean it like that, like indicators as neural structures that have a correlation to the outside world and a connection with the frog's and zebra's muscle, but without making the connection direct or necessary, then how is it different from beliefs? What Plantinga described then as indicator states in these cases are actually content-bearing states, so beliefs. But we'll say content-bearing states instead of belief, just because it may be controversial to say that non-language using animals have belief, or at least they have belief-like content-bearing states, which are certainly neural states. So creatures with neural structures have belief-like or content-bearing neural states with contents that are something like the following. That's a potential mate. That's potential food. That is toxic. That's a serious foe. That's an annoying parasite, and so forth. So by establishing that those are beliefs, meaning that the frog doesn't just rely on a mechanical, involuntary direct connection between its perception and its muscle to flick out its tongue for food, and that evolutionary history has fitted those creatures for the environment that they're in, meaning that frogs are doing well in their environment, we can then assert that their belief-like content-bearing states of these kinds will mostly be true. So we can say that Plantinga's first premise fails, or that he fails to establish the strong claim that on N and E there is no reason to suppose that any belief is true. So property of R giving N and E isn't low, apparently. But this is just for any belief. Remember that R is just the claim that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Just saying that Plantinga fails to establish that there is no reason to suppose that any belief is true isn't enough to suggest that under naturalism our cognitive faculties are reliable. It may be the case for specific beliefs. If I take, one particular belief, even under naturalism, there may be a high chance that the belief is true. In other words, there may be, some particular beliefs that remain true or likely to be true under naturalism as well. And so that's not enough to say that most of our beliefs are likely to be true. Of course, there is no reasonable claim that all of our beliefs are likely to be true. So for R to be true, all we need is that most of our beliefs are likely to be true. So if Plantinga fails to establish that under naturalism all of our beliefs are never likely to be true, then maybe he can argue for the claim that under naturalism most of our beliefs are unlikely to be true. So the objection to Oppy's objection to Plantinga's first premise is that it could still be true on N and E that the likelihood that most of our beliefs are true is very low. After all, we have beliefs about all kinds of things that played no role in the evolutionary history of our cognitive faculties. Given that our central processor is the product of evolutionary pressure, in large part from the complex social environments that human groups produced, what reason is there to think that it would yield a preponderance of true beliefs about, for example, complex scientific matters? So the objection is summed up in that first phrase. Maybe on N and E, the likelihood that most of our beliefs are true is very low. One way to argue for this objection is by saying that giving naturalistic accounts of evolution, our cognitive faculties are produced through natural selection and adaptation processes. Our beliefs that are produced by those faculties need to reinforce those same faculties into further evolutionary success and adaptation. If evolution has fitted us to be in our current environments, and our beliefs are likely to be true because true beliefs are more useful for reproduction, for survival and fitness in that environment, then you would expect that our beliefs to play a big role in the evolutionary history of our cognitive faculties. In other words, you expect that our beliefs to be all about what matters in evolution, which is survival and reproduction. Human cognition was shaped mainly by pressures such as, navigating physical spaces, avoiding predators, finding food, coordinating with others, interpreting social issues, etc. But anyone can easily see that it's not the case. We have many beliefs that play no role or contribution to our reproduction and survival. Like, we'd be able to do just fine, evolutionary speaking, without those beliefs. Metaphysical, philosophical, religious, political beliefs would have no reason to exist given that they don't contribute to our evolutionary history, and many of them have been proven wrong. So even scientific beliefs like ones about quantum mechanics, higher mathematics, or cosmology are not relevant to survival in those environments, even if true. So they played no causal role in why our cognitive systems evolved the way that they did. Why then did our central processor, our belief generator, produce those beliefs, and why would we suppose them to be true? So for this objection, we may not have to consider that beliefs that contribute to evolution of our faculties are unlikely to be true, but we sure as hell have plenty of beliefs, if not most of our beliefs, that have no contribution to that history. So, shouldn't we then say that their likelihood of being true is very low? Why should we think that our central processor is reliable, that it produces a preponderance of true beliefs if most of those beliefs play no role in evolutionary history? Well, we can start with the question about scientific beliefs, the beliefs about complex scientific matters. So here's Oppy's answer to that objection about those scientific beliefs. Short answer: the demands of living in complex social environments produced in us a sufficiently competent, all-purpose central processor whose possession allowed us to be molded into creatures that, over a very wide range, do have a preponderance of true beliefs. Education provides a corrective to many of the errors in beliefs to which we would otherwise be prone. In particular, while many, perhaps even most, of our intuitive beliefs about complex scientific matters are mistaken, we have developed social institutions and ways of living that allow us to correct the shortcomings of those intuitive beliefs. So, what's his answer? Well, he actually says a few things here. First, that although the human cognitive faculties evolved under pressure from complex social life rather than from the need to discover abstract scientific truths, this process nevertheless produced a flexible and generally reliable central processor. So in reality, we have a preponderance of true beliefs when it comes to adopting and responding to the demands of our complex social environments. And we also have reliable institutions and educational practices to test and correct our beliefs on that level. We can actually say that, the beliefs also produced by that same central processor. But anyway, so we can say that they play no role, in responding to the demands of our socially complex environments, like scientific abstract truths. That they are actually, the minority. In reality, we produce way more beliefs for pragmatic and adaptive purposes in response to our environment's demands than abstract scientific truths. So even if we won't have much reason to consider those scientific beliefs plausible, the fact remains that it turns out most beliefs are plausible. Plus, our central processor, or cognitive system, is not narrowly specialized but adaptable, enabling humans across many domains to hold mostly true beliefs. And what we said about education institutions, they also hold for scientific beliefs as well. It is true that most of our scientific beliefs have turned out to be mistaken, so the processor's reliability is not guaranteed at the level of raw intuition. Left to themselves, our intuitive judgments, especially about complex scientific matters, are often false. However, humans, they compensate for these limitations through education and socially organized practices such as teaching, peer reviewing or peer criticism, experimentation, and institutionalized inquiry, which usually arrives at expert consensus. So these social institutions, they function as corrective mechanisms that filter out error and refine belief to overcome the epistemic shortcomings of our intuitive cognition and arrive at a predominance of true beliefs even in domains far removed from our evolutionary origins. So given how well we also do in scientific matters and how careful we are in investing in this, developing all kinds of institutions to correct and limit error because we are aware that mistakes are common, it also shows that our processor is indeed reliable even in scientific matters. So we then don't need to limit ourselves to only what contributes to evolutionary history. How close a belief is to our evolutionary origins or how much it contributes to our evolutionary history has in fact little to do with its degree of reliability. So if Plantinga thinks that for naturalists the only criteria for true belief is how well the belief contributes to the evolutionary history of our cognitive faculties, then Plantinga is again wrong about naturalism and he's giving an arbitrary standard for evaluating the truth value of beliefs. As for the other areas in which there are no expert consensus and where our cognitive faculties are visibly and demonstrably unreliable, like in philosophy, religion, politics, etc., and we can also add to them all the various ways in which our uncorrected cognitive faculties are prone to error, like our systemic tendencies to ignore base rates, overestimate our own abilities, and so forth, well, they actually don't pose that much of a challenge. We already demonstrated that our faculties are reliable, meaning that they tend to produce a preponderance of true beliefs over false ones. When it comes to respond to our socially complex environments, when they are going into areas in which they are less reliable, we accept that our intuition can mislead us, but we are at least capable of developing reliable practices and institutions to correct our errors. If there remains some areas in which disputes and expert divergence is the norm, that still, wouldn't justify losing confidence in the reliability of our faculties and the plausibility that most of our beliefs are true. So whether you accept theism or naturalism, the plausibility of your belief being true and faculties being reliable don't change, actually. It remains high. So the fact that there are a few areas in which we are not good at discovering the truth, that shouldn't overshadow the fact that there are many areas where, at least collectively and at our best, we are quite good at discovering the truth. So this fact is enough to be confident that most of our beliefs are true and that our cognitive faculties are reliable, whether or not we accept N and E. So this is all to say that to test whether that first premise is true, you need to take all of your beliefs and divide them into two different fractions: true beliefs and non-true beliefs, in which you have you have false beliefs. Okay, you have false beliefs and beliefs that we cannot know if they are true or false. Okay, so you have true beliefs and non-true beliefs, in which you have false beliefs and the beliefs that you don't know yet if they are true or false. We then see which fraction is bigger. If the fraction of true beliefs is bigger than the other, then we have a preponderance of true beliefs over non-true beliefs. If our cognitive faculties are producing more true than non-true beliefs, then they are reliable. But that requires a method for estimating what fraction of our beliefs are true, which also likely depends upon our having a method for counting our beliefs. So we need a method for counting beliefs and then a method for estimating the fraction of our true beliefs. So let's start with the first one. Do we have a method for counting our beliefs? Well, there are difficulties with this question. If we have an infinite number of beliefs, an infinity of beliefs, true and false, that would be a problem for counting them, right? So there has to be a limit on how many beliefs we can actually have. So already we cannot believe anything that our beliefs entail, even if our beliefs are consistent and each belief automatically entails infinite beliefs. I believe that P entails that it is true, that P which entails that it is true, that it is true, that P which entails that it is true, that it is true, that it is true, that P, and so on. So given this, it might be too much that we count as belief anything that is entailed by things we believe, even if entailment is understood in formal terms, like we just mentioned. Believe that P is true, and that it is true, that it is true, that P is true, etc. So we get the same consequences even if we try to restrict entailment to just sufficiently obvious consequences of things that we believe. If I believe A and I believe B, then the consequence is that I believe that A and B, like A and B is itself a belief made of two beliefs, and so that same also holds for false beliefs. Everyone has some true and false beliefs. If B is a false belief but A is true, then as a consequence, I also have the false belief that A and B, which means that we always have at least just as many false beliefs as true beliefs, since we all have at least one false belief. So Oppy suggests to avoid these difficulties that we do an axiomatization of our beliefs, meaning that we just reduce them to some underlying axioms and take those axioms as counting beliefs. In other words, we suppose that our beliefs are represented by a set of mutually independent propositions, so axioms, which somehow yield all of our beliefs. Thus, we move from the problem of the plausible assumption that there are infinite beliefs to the plausible assumption that there is a finite axiomatization of our beliefs. So instead of counting all derived beliefs, we identify a set of mutually independent propositions that function as the person's basic commitments. And these axioms are not derived from one another, but together they generate the rest of our belief system. So if the axiomatization is finite, we can meaningfully ask what proposition of those axioms are true and use that as a proxy for whether a person's belief system overall contains a preponderance of true beliefs. So this is the procedure for estimating the fraction of our beliefs that are true. We simply look to the proportion of our axioms that are true. But the next paragraph is pointing out that axiomatization solves the problem only at a very abstract level, but it collapses once we ask how it could actually be used to assess the truth of our beliefs. There are two limits to axiomatization. First, it is not obvious that all axiomatizations will yield the same answer, and if different axiomatizations will yield different answers, then we do not yet have a satisfactory procedure. So first, Oppy notes that there's no unique and satisfactory way to choose the axioms. When we try to axiomatize someone's beliefs, depending on how we do it, we can get at different sets of different sets of axioms. An axiomatization is meant to give us a finite set of basic beliefs, like axioms, from which all other beliefs follow, right? Then we say, let's count only the axioms and see how many of them are true. But different axiomatizations are possible. Take a very simple belief set. Suppose you believe A, it is raining, and B, the ground is wet. Now consider two possible axiomatizations. Axiom 1, it is raining, and axiom 2, if it is raining, the ground is wet. Here, the ground is wet is derived, it is not a basic belief. But we can have another axiomatization in which there is only one axiom, it is raining and the ground is wet. Now this single axiom directly includes both claims. Both axiom sets generate the same total beliefs, but one has two axioms and the other has just one axiom. Already, the fraction of true axioms can differ depending on how you choose to package beliefs. And then depending on how you choose to package belief, which is already controversial, the fraction of true belief can change. Second, and more importantly, we cannot actually axiomatize anyone's beliefs, so we cannot actually use the procedure that we have outlined. So that's the second problem, which is more decisive. Oppy says that you just cannot axiomatize a real person's beliefs. We lack access to a complete inventory of their beliefs. We cannot reliably determine which beliefs are independent, and we cannot know which propositions genuinely function as axioms rather than derived commitments. As a result, the proposed procedure cannot be applied in practice. And lastly, just because the procedure is possible in principle, like conceptually speaking, we can estimate what fraction of our beliefs are true by estimating the proportion of our axioms that are true, but we are confronted with another gap. Even if we granted that a finite axiomatization exists and could somehow be identified, knowing how to estimate the truth of axioms does not explain why we should expect most axioms to be true in the first place. The move from if most axioms were true, then most beliefs would be true, to most axioms are in fact true is unjustified. It is unclear how to get from there to the claim that the preponderance of our axioms are true. And thus, axiomatization does not ultimately secure the epistemic conclusion it was meant to support. It merely postpones the central problem. So, does this lead us to a dead end? Well, not necessarily. This procedure that we are trying to build is just an attempt to justify the preponderance of our true axioms, right? And this procedure consists of examining our axioms. But apparently, examining our axioms seems futile because we can't arrive at the preponderance we want to justify, hence the problem. But who said that we have to examine them to reach that conclusion? Perhaps, as Oppy says, we actually don't need to examine our axioms in order to be justified in thinking that the preponderance of our axioms are true. For in fact, we can only attribute axioms to others on the assumption that the preponderance of their axioms are true. So, one possible reply is we don't need to check our axioms at all. Oppy associates this with Ludwig Wittgenstein and Donald Davidson. So their view holds that we do not need an independent justification for thinking that most of our axioms or basic beliefs are true, because the very act of attributing beliefs or axioms to a person already presupposes that most of them are true. On this view, belief, meaning, and rational agency are only intelligible against a background of widespread truth. If an agent's axioms were mostly false, we would no longer be able to interpret their words, actions, or judgments as expressing, beliefs at all. We would lose our grip on what they mean. So Davidson articulates this idea through the principle of charity. In order to interpret someone as a believer who refers to objects and states of affairs in the world, we must assume that their beliefs are, by and large, true and coherent. When we take someone to be talking about trees, about people, about events, we do so because we assume their perception and inferences generally track reality. Without this assumption, interpretation collapses not in disagreement, but into complete unintelligibility. Wittgenstein makes a closely related point by arguing that certain basic certainties are not justified by evidence, but are conditions for meaningful doubt and inquiry in the first place. We cannot sensibly call all our fundamental commitments into question at once, because doubt itself depends on their being in place. In other words, we just take it for granted that most of our axioms are true, because without that assumption, we won't be able to understand each other or attribute beliefs to other people, since I won't be able to know what other people actually believe. So, I need to make the presupposition that people's cognitive faculties are reliable and they produce a preponderance of true axioms and beliefs across a wide range of domains. As Oppy says, we need to presuppose a body of true axioms in order to make attributions of axioms. It can be that all or nearly all of the axioms of a given agent are false. In particular, if we are to make sense of someone as a believing agent, then we shall need to suppose that their cognitive faculties of perception, memory, a priori intuition, sympathy, introspection, testimony, moral sense, and so forth, deliver bodies of true axioms across a range of domains. But this can be challenged as begging the question. We assume the main point at issue. Why? Because the original problem was not, can any axiom be true? Or can many axioms be true? The Wittgenstein-Davidson move only gets us to a weaker claim than what the main problem is, which is, are most of my axioms true and in the right domains? The response only guarantees the delivery of bodies of true axioms across a range of domains, meaning in some domains. In simpler terms, the response just says there must be enough true axioms somewhere for interpretation to work. This doesn't justify that there is a preponderance of true beliefs generated by our cognitive faculties, but just that we can be sure that there is such preponderance in some domains. However, if we only have that preponderance in a few domains, while in the vast majority of domains we have a preponderance of false beliefs, or if the domains in which we have preponderance of true beliefs are as many as those in which we have preponderance of false beliefs, then our cognitive faculties aren't that reliable. Or what if, for example, we just produce a small number of axioms in all the domains in which you have a preponderance of true axioms, but a huge number of axioms in which in those domains, in which you have a preponderance of false axioms. Like you have just 5 domains in total, you produce 2 axioms in 4 domains where they are true, but 20 in the one domain where they are all false. So you end up with 8 true axioms, but 20 false ones. And so your faculties aren't reliable. So the Wittgenstein-Davidson response is still consistent with the claim that those same cognitive faculties deliver bodies of entirely false axioms across other domains. And moreover, it is also consistent to suppose that some agents have more axioms that belong to the second set of domains than to the first. So the Wittgenstein-Davidson move only gets us this weaker claim, but that does not establish that my axioms are mostly true, or that they are true in the domains that matter for the philosophical argument here. Oppy gives the following example. Consider Paul. Paul is a philosophical obsessive. He spends almost all of his waking time engaged in developing his own philosophical system. Alas, as it happens, Paul's philosophical system is completely misbegotten. None of the axioms that belong to his philosophical system are true. Moreover, Paul's philosophical system involves a vast number of axioms. His system is comprehensive in its ambition and extraordinarily detailed in its development. While Paul's cognitive faculties deliver plenty of true axioms in other domains, it simply isn't true that overall his cognitive faculties deliver a majority, let alone a preponderance, of true axioms, because Paul's cognitive faculties spend so much time churning out false philosophical axioms. So, what to make of this? Well, we have someone named Paul who devotes nearly all of his mental energy to construct and elaborate extremely ambitious and highly detailed philosophical worldview with a large number of axioms. Unfortunately, he gets all the axioms wrong. None of his system's fundamental principles are correct, which means that although his faculties function well in many other domains, in many other areas, such as in perception, memory, and everyday reasoning, where they generate many true beliefs, his belief-forming faculties do not produce mostly true axioms in philosophy. But because he spends so much time and effort in that domain, in the domain of philosophy, so he generates more axioms and principles in that domain than in others. And therefore, because of that time he spends generating false philosophical principles, the total body of axioms that he holds is determined by error rather than truth. So the Wittgenstein-Davidson response can still make an objection to the Paul story by simply saying that it doesn't ring true. This story relies on a version of a person that lives in such a way that all or most of his faculties are devoted to produce beliefs and axioms concerning non-mundane matters, which is highly unlikely even for the matters of philosophy. In mundane matters, we obviously produce more true beliefs than false ones. So to say that the response misses the original problem, which is about most of our axioms, is wrong, because you will never find someone whose faculties produce more beliefs that concern non-mundane matters than mundane matters. So realistically speaking, everyone will produce beliefs about mundane matters more than about non-mundane matters. Given that beliefs about mundane matters tend to be more true than false, then they will far exceed the total of false beliefs people hold, so our cognitive faculties are reliable. Even a philosophy-obsessed person works with axioms about, mundane matters more than about axioms, about axioms unrelated to mundane matters. For any person, even a philosophical obsessive, the vast bulk of their axioms concern mundane matters, their own immediate environment, their own comfort, and so forth. And in those kinds of domain, on Wittgensteinian and Davidsonian grounds, it must be that their cognitive faculties deliver a preponderance of true axioms. But this again misses an important element about the domains in which we produce axioms and beliefs, and that is, which domains matter. Sure, if we go with quantity alone, then maybe we can argue that our faculties are reliable. You just say, my faculties are reliable because they produce more true beliefs than false beliefs. But what if we also include the requirement that in order for my beliefs to be reliable, for my faculties, to be reliable, I also need to produce more true belief than false belief about certain specific matters. Let's suppose that the domain of philosophy is the domain that matters the most. If I produce a preponderance of true beliefs in all the other domains but fail to do so in this one, even if my true beliefs outnumber my false beliefs, my faculties still aren't reliable. If that's the case, then Plantinga's argument may have won a battle but lost the war. Plantinga's premise that the probability of R giving n and e is low would then be true. It would be false if the domain that matters are those in which we produce axioms and beliefs about our own immediate environment, our own comfort, and so forth. But if we establish that the domains that matters are not those one, and we establish that in those domains our faculties are reliable, so that already disproves Plantinga's premise only if our faculties are primarily concerned with delivering axioms concerning those domains. If they actually are, then probability of R giving n and e is high, and the first premise of Plantinga's argument is false. But even if they are not, even if in reality what concerns us the most are the other domains in which our faculties are unreliable, and so his premise becomes true that probability of R giving n and e is actually low, because it produces a preponderance of false beliefs in metaphysical matters, which means that R actually becomes R prime. And so EAAN simply turns into EAAN prime, and so like we undermined EAAN prime, we just repeat our objection to it. So as Oppy says, if our cognitive faculties are primarily concerned with the delivery of highly theoretical axioms of philosophy, politics, religion, and so forth, like that's the domain that matters, then it is a mistake to suppose that our cognitive faculties are reliable, and it is actually a point in favor of n and e, that the probability of R giving n and e is low. And so that's it for Plantinga's first premise. Now, whether probability of R giving n and e is low is actually true or false, in both cases, it's actually a point in favor of naturalism, or at least, it doesn't favor theism over naturalism at all. So with this in mind, what would happen to the second premise of Plantinga's argument? Would the argument still hold? For a reminder, Plantinga's second premise is no one who accepts n and e and recognizes that probability of R giving n and e is low can accept R. So this premise is supposed to argue that given that naturalists accept n and e and accept R, but if his first premise is true, then naturalists also accept it. They recognize that probability of R giving n and e is low, right? So naturalists accept naturalism, that they and their faculties have come to be in the way proposed by contemporary evolutionary theory. They accept that faculties are reliable, and they also accept that given naturalism, it's implausible that their faculties are reliable. And so naturalists are contradicting themselves. Checkmate. They cannot reasonably suppose that our cognitive faculties are reliable, i.e. that our cognitive faculties deliver a preponderance of true beliefs. So here's the math. Remember the Bayesian rule. To know the probability of something giving another thing, the probability of A giving B is probability of A, this is written this way, probability PR between parentheses A/B. So probability of A giving B equals probability of A and B divided by probability of B. So to know the probability of R giving naturalism, it is probability of R giving N and E equals probability of R and E and N divided by probability of N and E. That is probability of R and N and E equals the probability of R giving N and E multiplied by the probability of N and E. So if probability of R giving N and E is low, then the probability of R and N and E must also be low, unless probability of N and E is extremely high, which of course Plantinga doesn't accept. So the probability that someone accepts that their own cognitive faculties are reliable and that they are the product of evolutionary evolution and accept naturalism has to be low for probability of R giving N and E to be low, right? But given that naturalists, they don't accept Plantinga's first premise, that giving naturalism our faculties reliability remains high, then a naturalist accepts that naturalism and evolution is plausible and that his faculties are reliable. So someone who accepts N and E supposes that the probability of N and E is not low. Someone who accepts R supposes that probability of R and N and E is not low. But if neither probability of R and N and E nor probability of N and E is low, then contrary to our hypothesis, probability of R giving N and E cannot be low. So I think the second premise of Plantinga's argument is correct. So the second premise is correct indeed. No one who accepts N and E and recognizes that the probability of R giving N and E is low can accept R. That premise is true. No one can accept naturalism and evolution, that our cognitive faculties are reliable, and Plantinga's first premise. The issue is that Plantinga thought that naturalists do accept all three, but we actually don't. We actually reject that first premise. So what we accept is N and E. Naturalism is true and evolutionary, and that our cognitive faculties are the way that they are because of evolution. We also accept R. We accept that our cognitive faculties are reliable, and we accept that the probability of R giving N and E is actually high, which is not the first premise that Plantinga tries to make. So yeah, without that first premise being true, the argument actually doesn't hold, even if the second premise of the argument is true. So now we move to the third premise, which is also like his second. So let's look at it again. If you have a defeature for R, then you have a defeature for any other belief you think you have, which also includes naturalism. It says no one who denies or fails to accept that our cognitive faculties are reliable can rationally believe anything at all. In other words, if someone denies or fails to accept that her cognitive faculties produce a preponderance of true belief, then that one is not rationally entitled to believe anything at all. So Plantinga thinks that naturalism must provide a defeature for R if it wants to be consistent. But if you give a defeature for R, then as a consequence, you have also given a defeature to your beliefs. Naturalists must accept that they cannot believe anything. Now, this premise is just mistaken. Even if the first premise is true, that the probability of R giving N and E is low, that doesn't give a defeature for R. And it doesn't follow that you can't rationally be entitled to believe anything at all. If we take again, the example of Paul and add the assumption that he also recognized that it is very unlikely that he has a preponderance of true philosophical beliefs, then we have a guy who is a philosophical obsessive, but whose faculties produce a preponderance of false philosophical beliefs, but he is aware of or recognizes that it is likely the case. But does Paul, just because he recognizes that it is very likely that he has a preponderance of false philosophical beliefs, does he have to also admit that he cannot rationally trust any of his beliefs? Does it follow from this that Paul is not rationally entitled to beliefs about his own immediate environment, about his own comfort, and so forth? Well, obviously no. Even if his faculties produce more false than true philosophical beliefs, and most of his beliefs are philosophical beliefs, meaning that his faculties produce a preponderance of false beliefs overall, it doesn't mean that his non-philosophical beliefs are also false. As Oppy says, indeed, so long as Paul thinks it rather likely that his cognitive faculties produce a preponderance of true beliefs concerning his own immediate environment, his own comfort, and so forth, there is not even a prima facie problem that arises for him. But Plantinga can still argue that while it is true that Paul isn't forced to accept that he can't rationally hold any beliefs, his premise still works against naturalism. If Paul is a naturalist, meaning that he believes that N and E, and since naturalism is a philosophical belief, then his belief that his cognitive faculties produce mostly false philosophical beliefs does undermine his rational entitlement to believe that N and E. But actually, this doesn't undermine naturalism. If we are generous, all that it does is undermine naturalism for Paul and only Paul. The problem is just that Paul is a philosophy obsessive who produces mostly philosophical beliefs. But take someone else. Take, for example, Paul's brother Saul. Now, what about him? Well, Saul is an obsessive too, but not in philosophy. He's a political obsessive. But he's as obsessive about politics as Paul is about philosophy, and with the same preponderance of political beliefs, and he recognizes that. He recognizes that he very likely has a preponderance of false political beliefs, given that he is constantly producing them just as much as Paul is producing philosophical beliefs. But he has a few rare occasions where he forms philosophical beliefs too. Given that he has only a very small number of philosophical beliefs, he supposes that his cognitive faculties produce a preponderance of true philosophical beliefs on those rare occasions when he forms philosophical beliefs. Suppose that one of those very few beliefs one of them is naturalism. In Saul's case, he does not have his rational entitlement to believe that N and E undermined in the same way as Paul. So, it is true that Paul seems to have a challenge if he believes that N and E and accepts that N and E is a philosophical belief and supposes that his cognitive faculties mostly produce false philosophical beliefs, but not Saul. Plus, like we said at the end of the section Truth, this reply about metaphysical beliefs abandons R for R prime, which means that it effectively abandons EAAN in favor of EAAN prime, and therefore it concedes that the third premise of EAAN is false. So the third premise of EAAN was trying to argue for the claim that a defeater to R means that we cannot rationally believe anything, while the relevance of the Paul story here completely abandons this premise for another, that a defeater to R means that we cannot rationally believe not any belief but just naturalism. So the Paul story reply fails as a defense for EAAN. We will come back to it because we're not really done with EAAN prime, but let's first conclude the examination of EAAN before turning to EAAN prime and the Paul reply with now premise 4. So before that, however, there is still this fourth premise in EAAN, the EAAN argument, which is if anyone who believes naturalism and evolution is unable to rationally believe anything at all, then belief in N and E is self-defeating and N and E and cannot be rationally believed. So Oppy isn't going to challenge this premise because since it is the consequence of premise 3 and premise 3 is false, well, premise 4 is basically can only be true if premise 3 is true. Then, you know, belief in N and E is self-defeating, but we just said that belief in N and E doesn't entail that you are unable to believe anything at all. So the fourth premise is obviously false. So let's just move on. So what to conclude? Well, the verdict is EAAN fails. Before even arguing against Plantinga's argument, we can note that it has serious problems involved in even making sense of claims about ratios of truth to non-truth in systems of beliefs. In other words, what does it even mean to say that a whole belief system contains mostly true beliefs? Beliefs are not, all of the same kind. They vary in scope, importance, abstraction, and testability, which makes counting them and assigning a truth ratio to them already philosophically shaky. Still, Oppy says that even if we grant Plantinga this assumption, his argument still fails. He argues that we shouldn't expect to find evolved creatures with reliable cognitive faculties, right? And the fact that we have cognitive faculties should be a point against naturalism. However, having reliable faculties doesn't defeat naturalism at all, because under naturalism, having such faculties would actually make sense. On EAAN, we should expect evolved creatures' cognitive faculties to deliver a healthy preponderance of true beliefs concerning their immediate environment, their own comfort, and so forth. So under evolution plus naturalism, natural selection favors accurate beliefs about the immediate environment, about dangers, about food, about predators, about pain, about comfort, survival relevant matters, etc. Because false belief in these domains, get you killed. So evolution gives us reliability where it matters for survival, but it doesn't give us reliability everywhere. However, this puts Plantinga in a dilemma because he has to either abandon his first premise or his third premise, depending on what we assume about the distribution of our beliefs. If we accept that our faculties are reliable for immediate survival purposes, this blows his first premise. And if we accept that it's not reliable elsewhere, this blows his third premise. As Oppy says, on the one hand, if we suppose that most of a creature's beliefs concern its immediate environment, on comfort, and so forth, then Plantinga's first premise is just false. The probability of R giving N and E is high. On the other hand, if we suppose that most of a creature's beliefs concern things other than its immediate environment, on comfort, and so forth, then while Plantinga's first premise may be true, his third premise will then be false. For in that case, a creature's cognitive faculties will deliver a preponderance of true beliefs over the smaller domain of its beliefs concerning its immediate environment, on comfort, and so forth, while failing to deliver a preponderance of true beliefs over the domain of all of its beliefs. So in short, if we suppose that most of a creature's beliefs concern its immediate environment, on comfort, etc., then evolution strongly favors true beliefs. So cognitive faculties are reliable in most cases, and therefore the probability of R giving N and E is actually high. It's not low at all. So that directly contradicts Plantinga's first premise. EAAN collapses immediately if this is right. And if we suppose that most of a creature's beliefs concern things other than its immediate environment, like abstract metaphysics, mathematics, theology, modal logic, distant cosmology, etc., then in that case, Plantinga might be right that overall reliability across all belief is low, but now he has to face a new problem. Plantinga also needs the claim that if our cognitive faculties are unreliable, then all our beliefs are are undermined, including belief in evolution and naturalism. But even if faculties are unreliable globally, they can still be reliable locally in the restricted domain of survival relevant beliefs or beliefs or matters. And those local beliefs are exactly what evolution selects for. So a creature's cognitive faculties will deliver a preponderance of true belief over the smaller domain, while failing to deliver a preponderance of true beliefs over the domain of all of its beliefs. And so this means that you don't get a global defeater. You can rationally still trust beliefs about perception, inference, science, evolutionary theory itself, even if you remain agnostic or skeptical about very abstract beliefs. So Plantinga's third premise fails. Unreliability does not spread everywhere. So Oppy's conclusion is this: either most beliefs are survival related and therefore probability of R giving N and E is high and therefore EAAN fails, or most beliefs are abstract beliefs, but then local reliability remains, which means that we don't have a global defeater and therefore EAAN also fails. So no matter how you slice the belief system, Plantinga's argument cannot get off the ground. In short, evolution gives us the kind of reliability that we need, where we need it, and that is enough to block EAAN. Now, we need to come to EAAN prime and the Paul reply about metaphysical beliefs which trades R for R prime. So EAAN prime has three premises, two of which can be accepted by naturalism, the first premise and the second premise. Remember that R prime is different from R, in that R claims that most of our cognitive faculties are reliable, while R prime claims that most of our faculties that produce metaphysical beliefs are reliable. In Plantinga's EAAN prime, premise 1 claims that probability of R prime giving N and E is low, and the second premise, no one who accepts N and E and recognizes that the probability of R giving N and E is low can accept R prime. So naturalists, they can accept both of these claims. Probability that R prime giving N and E. So naturalists, they can accept both of these claims. They recognize that it is implausible that most of the faculties that produce specifically metaphysical beliefs are reliable. So they don't need, they actually don't accept R prime. But the problem in Plantinga, which reveals his fallacy, is in his third premise, which is that it is impossible to rationally accept naturalism and evolution if we reject the claim that the faculties that produce metaphysical beliefs are reliable. And here lies his mistake. In reality, it is perfectly possible to rationally accept N and E, even though one rejects R prime. Plantinga's mistake is assuming that it is an inconsistency to 1. accept a bunch of axioms, while 2. supposing that it is unlikely that any conjunction of most of those axioms is true. But we can demonstrate that 1 and 2 are not inconsistent with one another. The trick just simply lies in not giving too much credence to philosophical axioms, which wouldn't be controversial at all. It's perfectly natural to suppose low credence to philosophical axioms, given the strong lack of expert agreement in philosophy. Given the state of expert philosophical opinion, it seems eminently sensible not to give too much credence to your philosophical axioms. However, this isn't admitting defeat, because giving a moderate credence to your overall philosophical axioms can just be due to the fact that you give low credence to most, if not, the vast majority of your axioms, while giving high credence to some of them. Plantinga's third premise wants you to give a low credence to all axioms, including naturalism, but because you accepted that R prime is implausible. But to quote Oppy, does it then follow that naturalists cannot rationally give very high credence to naturalism? Not at all. The credence that one gives to one's axioms can be moderate even if the credence given to some axioms is very high. So, you can give a high credence to naturalism while a low credence to most of your axioms. Oppy gives the following example. Suppose that I have 10 axioms, one of which is naturalism, to which I give a credence of 1, so certainly true, okay? And the remaining 9 get 0.51 each. I'm not going to go through the math, but according to Oppy, this should give me a credence of 0.27 to the claim that more than 2/3, so most, of my axioms are true. The point is, it is below 0.5, meaning that even if we grant absolute certainty that naturalism is true, we still consistently can accept that most of our philosophical beliefs are implausible and that our faculties in that regard aren't reliable. In Oppy's words, it seems that I can consistently hold that I am not reliable in my philosophical believing, while nonetheless being certain of my naturalism. And if we, lower the credence given to naturalism, because it may seem irrational to give it credence 1, that will just, drive down the credence that I should give to the claim that more than 2/3 of my axioms are true. So we still reject EAAN Prime's third premise. All right, then, that is it. We are done. The argument fails. There's a disclaimer about some topics that Plantinga brings in his exposition and defense of EAAN that Oppy didn't mention or talked about, like controversial stances on the interpretation of probability claims, the semantics of counterfactuals, and the conditionalization problem. I'm not going into those here, and it's not like they save his argument anyway. So plus addressing them is beyond the scope of this chapter, and I'm not going to compare Plantinga's argument and where the conflict lies with the argument's earliest versions that he proposed earlier before the 2011 book for the same reasons. But if you are interested and wish to do the comparison yourself with Oppy's criticism in mind of the updated version of the argument, you have his 1991 article, An Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism, his 1993 book, Warrant and Proper Function, and his 1994 article, Naturalism Defeated, and 2002 article, Reply to Bailey's cohorts. I will link them in the description if you want to have a look at them. But yeah, that's it for the argument. So let's now end the episode and conclude the chapter, Does Science Defeat Naturalism? With a no. The conclusion of our discussion of Plantinga 2011, so Plantinga's book Where the Conflict Really Lies, is that it fails to show that there is any conflict between science and naturalism. While it is an open question whether there is conflict between science and Plantinga's theism, there is nothing in Plantinga's 2011 book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, that supports the claim that naturalism is defeated by science. So that's it for today. We concluded the chapter, Does Science Defeat Naturalism? The answer is no. Next week we move to the 6th chapter, which is about religion. Does religion defeat naturalism? And we are going to take a look at the argument advanced by Michael C. Rea in the first episode. I'm going to do 2 episodes on that chapter as well. So the first episode will be about Michael C. Rea's argument against naturalism, and then the episode after that will take on the rest of the chapter, which will look at the argument against naturalism from Thomism, so from the philosophy of theologian Thomas Aquinas. And that would be it for the 6th chapter. So that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that